Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our Trails as Resilient Infrastructure webinar. I will introduce all of our panelists in just a moment, but I am Steph Knoll with the Oregon Trails Coalition, and we're really happy to be partnering with these other presenters here today to offer this webinar. We will invite you throughout the webinar to share questions using the chat and Q&A feature, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But also, as folks are still joining us, we want to invite all of our attendees today, if you like, to introduce yourself in the chat. If you want to choose the everyone option as opposed to the host and panelist option, you'll be able to let other folks know who's joining us today. And if you just want to share your name, location, if you like, what town or city you're dialing in from, and any hats you're wearing professionally or as a volunteer advocate. It's always fun to know who's joining us for these webinars. So our presenters today, we'll hear from both Carrie Asclar and Emily Lauderdale with Toole Design and John Wentworth with the Mammoth Lakes Trails and Public Access Foundation. So we're really grateful to all of them for joining us today. And before we dive into the main webinar content, I wanted to share just a little bit about the current federal context that we're operating in. And you might hear some more from John and other folks about this right now too. But I know it's a big thing of big concern with a lot of people in a lot of different roles, especially for those of us out west where so much of our land base is federal lands. And there's a lot of relevancy with today's topic and how we manage our land bases and our trail infrastructure on them. But where things stand right now, and they're changing a lot, and sometimes unpredictably, but there are some things we do know. We do know that we're facing some major staffing shortages in our federal agencies. And for instance, for the Forest Service Region 6, which is the Oregon-Washington region, we know we're down about 1,000 positions between last year's seasonal staff hiring freeze and all of the recent kind of voluntary exits and other ways we've seen staff leaving the Forest Service. So there's a lot of uncertainty and backups there. We know that there's uncertainty and likely some more structural changes ahead with our federal agencies, how wildfire is managed, and kind of what our public agency infrastructure looks like. And a lot of uncertainty also not just for federal lands, but for other agencies and organizations that receive federal grants and other federal funding streams. We know that current administration priorities for our federal lands are really focused on timber, energy, wildfire. You know, there is opportunities, I think, to really look at the wildfire priority, also the rural jobs priority, and safety and access, which have also been framed as priorities in our work here today. And then lastly, we just wanted to identify that there's been a number of executive orders, and you know, as some of these are continue to be challenged in court and through other mechanisms, we don't know where everything will land. But for folks who are involved in this work, some of the executive orders that might be relevant to work are both the Unleashing American Energy order and the order around DEI activities in terms of how we talk about our work. It is impossible to separate this topic from the topic of climate change and climate resilience in terms of the effects of big weather events and wildfires, et cetera, on this work. So we will be using kind of appropriate language to talk about it today. But we do definitely encourage folks as they're actually working on projects with different partners to be cognizant of these executive orders and how we frame and talk about the work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on too. But just wanted to name some of the federal context that we're all working in right now on this important topic. There's lots of opportunity to do good work both across federal and non-federal lands, and we hope there'll be lots of good content today that is helpful for people in whatever context that you may be working, planning, advocating, etc. So with that little bit of context, just once again, for folks who are joining us, please, if you like, introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who's joining us live today. And that's fun for other webinar participants too, to know the community, have a little glimpse into the community they're learning with today. And please share your questions throughout in the Q&A and chat, and we'll make sure to elevate those to our presenters' attention. If not during the webinar, if not during the presentations, then we'll have some Q&A time at the end. So with that, I'll stop my screen share and pass it on to Carrie for the next bit of this.
Great, thank you, Steph. Hi, everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to take a moment to get my slides on our screens here. Can you see my screen? Is everything coming through?
Yes, looks great, thank you.
Great. Again, thank you and welcome to this webinar. My name is Carrie Asklar. I'm a transportation planner for Toole Design, a national planning, engineering, and design firm that works on multimodal transportation. I've had the pleasure of working on trails on the West Coast from a network level perspective to an on-the-ground design perspective, as well as on-street active transportation planning and design. I'm happy to be joined by my colleague, Emily Lauderdale, who I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Carrie. Yep, I'm Emily Lauderdale. I work out of the Toole Design Madison, Wisconsin office. I'm a landscape architect, and I have the excellent job of working on trails and greenways projects across the country. I also had the great opportunity to actually work on as a writer for the FHWA guidebook that we'll be discussing shortly.
Awesome, thanks, Emily. So we have some great topics to present today. Emily mentioned the Federal Highway Administration's Trails as Resilient Infrastructure Guidebook, and then we'll pass it on to the Mammoth Lakes Trails and Public Access and the CALREC Vision Joint Strategy. But for a moment, starting with the Trails as Resilient Infrastructure Guidebook, the FHWA published this guide towards the end of 2023. And as Emily mentioned, we had the pleasure of working with our partners on this first of its kind guide. Since 2023 was a long time ago, it does have language such as climate change and resiliency and equity, as Steph mentioned. Those terms have kind of shifted in how the federal administration is defining those, if they're using those. I just want to let you folks know that through this presentation, I'll continue to use these words since they're reflected in this guide. But first, I think it's helpful to ground our understanding of resiliency, which is essentially the ability to prepare, react, and bounce back from disruption. Those disruptions can be on many different scales, but for now, we'll focus on natural disasters and the role of trails in building that resiliency. Continue framing the purpose of this guide. I think many folks know that our climate is changing significantly, and that is impacting our natural environments by causing extreme and severe weather events. So how do trails connect with climate change? Trails are critical in talking about climate change and resiliency. I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but for framing this presentation, trails are important pieces of infrastructure for both recreation and transportation to shift our travel behaviors away from fossil fuels and carbon emissions. Trails provide a redundant network for folks to use rather than streets. Trails are also often located in vulnerable environmental areas such as riparian and coastal corridors, forests, on slopes, etc. And then lastly, trails can be really valuable cultural and social resources as community gathering spaces. So this FHWA guide brings these two topics together to posit that trails can be planned and designed in a way to mitigate and adapt to climate change. To do that, this guide brings these two topics together by addressing gaps in understanding the diverse context that trails are located in, understanding the role of trails in climate mitigation and adaptation, and understanding how we can plan and design trails to address climate change, and also highlighting the gaps, the resources to fill those gaps. This guide addresses those gaps by highlighting best practices in this area of context-based trail planning and design, trail siting and construction, management and maintenance, as well as emergency response. Essentially, this guide is an effort to address these gaps in understanding trails and how they are uniquely situated in these changing climate conditions. The next few slides will show examples of how climate change is impacting trails today. So, starting with flooding and sea level rise. Many trails and greenways, as I mentioned, are located along rivers and streams and coastlines, making them vulnerable to flooding, which can include seasonal, tidal, and permanent flooding. Flooding can also damage trail surfacing and paving by undercutting the base core, which impacts retaining walls and structures, and this can result in saturated soil flow. This creates an obvious maintenance burden for agencies by closing trails and causing short-term and long-term maintenance implications to address those repairs and damages. In Oregon, our coast varies quite a bit, but this could also have implication for trails such as the Oregon Coast Trail and the Oregon Coast Bike Route. I also want to quickly mention, as I was digging into this topic in Oregon, we also often think about the Cascadia earthquake, which is not an event directly connected to climate change, but something we think about a lot. That earthquake has the potential to lower our coastline by a few feet, which would expedite that coastal flooding. So what would take 80-ish years to adjust our sea level as it impacts the coastline, that would happen in about 3 minutes. So as a real world example, the Mill Valley Sausalito Path in Marin County, California, which you can see here on the screen, that trail floods several times a year now during king tides and high tides with storm surges. And this prompted the county to relocate that path and raise it by several feet to plan for sea level rise. And you can see that realignment on the map on the left. Fire has always shaped the West's natural landscapes through both seasonal wildfires as well as intentional burns by Native American communities. However, climate change is really enhancing the drying of organic matter in forests, which has doubled the number of large fires between 1984 and 2015 in the Western US. So wildfires are now becoming more frequent, expanding across the typical wildfire season. They're also becoming more intense and more devastating. In addition to damage to trails and trail structures and amenities, fire damage really impacts the landscape as well. This obviously impacts plants and animal communities, but also creates hazardous conditions like dying trees, unstable soils, etc. And I think specific to Oregon, many folks probably remember the 2020 Alameda fire, the most destructive fire in Oregon history, the 2021 Bootleg fire, and many other wildfires that we've had in our communities. So next is extreme heat. And I think speaking of events that folks remember, I'm sure folks remember the heat dome of 2020 in Oregon. That heat event resulted in 100 related heat deaths throughout the West. So heat events like this are becoming increasingly common with climate change. This extreme heat really impacts our infrastructure, as you can see asphalt buckling in this photo in Washington. And extreme heat also presents a safety risk for trail users. All of this is really hard to digest. It's a lot of information, but it's also really important to acknowledge that climate change impacts vulnerable communities in disparate ways. For example, in hotter parts of the state, higher temperatures and poor air quality impact people who use trails for transportation. Thus, those folks bear a higher burden for climate change. Also, some populations with fewer resources are disproportionately affected by heat and smoke and often have fewer options available to them in natural disasters. Trails can bring equitable access to active transportation and recreation, which is great. but they can also have an impact on displacement through moving people to escape or avoid climate change, and as well as have an impact on gentrification. A lot of folks probably know there's a clear connection between redlined neighborhoods from the early 20th century, which prevented Black and Brown communities from home loans in certain areas, and neighborhoods today with fewer local environmental resources, such as the lack of trees, parks, green space, making these areas hotter than wealthier, whiter, non-redlined neighborhoods. These are really complex issues that must be acknowledged and must be addressed in all stages of planning for climate resilient trails. And now I'll transition to Emily to talk about how we adapt trails to climate impacts.
Thanks, Carrie. So the second half of the guidebook offers planning, design, and management solutions for the climate impacts that Carrie just described. And I'll now get into a few of the adaptation techniques and provide a couple of examples that we have from case studies in the guidebook. Next slide. So the first topic of managing water. Using green infrastructure and minimizing impacts to wetlands and streams and stream restoration projects are obvious tools for managing water. Grading and drainage are the key tools for managing flooding, storm surges, and sea level rise. Some climate adaptive construction methods that specifically look at things like trail surfacing material. So how resilient is the material to inundation or flowing water? Those types of projects or viewpoints can be incorporated into trail projects. And then also looking at structures and boardwalks. So thinking about whether culverts can handle higher volumes of water, or whether or not bridges and boardwalks can handle higher water levels and debris flows, and then incorporating that modeling into design of structures. Next slide. And yep. So one of the case studies that we included in the guidebook on the topic of flooding is the Houston Bayou Greenways. So the city of Houston experienced some really massive flooding and hurricanes from 2016 to 2020. And they recognized these issues as really continuous, especially with the rapid urbanization that they were experiencing. The city has now embraced the role of the bayous as Houston's front yard, and it's become a part of an overall strategy to improve physical, environmental, and economic resilience. The city's approach to management included removing structures from the floodway, expanding stormwater detention and infiltration, and developing trails that provide recreation, transportation, and community health benefits. They also changed their model from asphalt surfacing to a 6-inch concrete cross-section for trails within the bayou in the floodway. Trails are designed with an 18 to 36-inch turn down. That was actually shown in an image in the previous slide, which is a piece of the edge of the trail, and it's used to protect the underside of trails from being washed out by flooding. And then I'll also note the city installed 911 discs and embedded those into the trail every quarter mile. And these 911 discs have point identifiers for trail users to communicate their exact location to emergency dispatchers. Just an interesting point of this one, and also highlights what Carrie introduced earlier about trails as part of emergency response and preparedness. Go to the next slide. The next topic is really on managing for heat and extreme heat. So as instances of extreme heat increase in severity, frequency, and length, we really need to implement more strategies for handling heat to support, one, the trail user experience. And we can do that by thinking about ways to keep trail users safe from heat-related illness and keep trails functional as transportation and recreation facilities. And that could be done by providing shade. So either constructed shade like you see in the image there, or tree canopy. Also places to rest and drinking water for people and pets are really important. And then also thinking about features like water features or vegetation that have a cooling effect. And then the other way to look at things is, how we need to be thinking about trail surfacing materials. So heat can impact some surfacing materials like asphalt quite a bit more than others like concrete. And next slide, please. So the guidebook includes a case study on the CV link. And during the summer months, average high temperatures in the Coachella Valley sometimes reach up to 120 degrees. And climate models suggest that the region will just continue to grow drier and hotter. The CV link is 40 miles long and is designed to provide a convenient, safe, high-capacity pathway through the Coachella Valley for pedestrians, bicyclists, and also low-speed electric vehicles. They chose concrete as the primary trail surface. It's 8 inches thick and 14 feet wide. And unlike asphalt, which becomes brittle in the hot climate without regular automobile traffic, concrete provides a more stable surface over time. The CV link also includes shade structures every 1 to 2 miles and water fountains where feasible, where they're able to hook up to a water supply. And the structures, as you can see in the image here, are angled, and they actually provide shade for the path in late afternoons of summer when the heat is most intense. Go on to the next slide. So the final topic area that I want to talk about is managing for fire. So it's a topic that's very relevant to Oregon, of course. And there are 2 lenses from which to view trails and wildfire. The first is thinking about protecting trails from damage due to wildfire. So things like destruction of infrastructure like bridges, or downed trees or standing dead trees or snags that create a safety hazard for trail users. And then, of course, erosion following wildfire. And then secondly, we want to think about how trails can be integrated into wildfire management planning. And John will be talking about this a little bit more in just a bit. But we can think about managing trail corridors as fuel breaks and incorporating trails as access routes for wildland firefighters. Go on to the next slide. So the guidebook includes the Bear Creek Greenway in Jackson County as a case study of wildfire and trails. So the Bear Creek Greenway is a riparian corridor and trail in the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon. And the trail was severely damaged in September of 2020 by the Almeda fire, which burned 3,200 acres and destroyed 2,500 residents. And really damaged a significant portion of the trail. The trail was bordered by flammable invasive blackberry and poison hemlock, which allowed the fire to spread quite quickly along the ground and get into the canopy of the native riparian vegetation along creek and primarily cottonwoods, which resulted in really catastrophic impacts to water quality and habitat for the salmon-bearing stream. I think the Greenway was really set up quite well. So for handling this situation, a joint powers agreement was actually established in 2007 with Jackson County and the 5 cities that are responsible for managing the trail. And this agreement played a significant role in the fairly quick response following the fire, because there already had been a precedent for strong collaboration. The managing agencies quickly mobilized to address the water quality impacts of the fire. Damage was mapped and prioritized for remedial seeding, treatments to hold the soil in place, and actually a high school cross-country team that had used the trail for running practice assisted with seeding and spreading straw. So it was a good example of community and working collaboratively together to rehabilitate the Greenway. And since then, local and regional governments, acknowledging that a warmer and drier climate means larger fires, have come together to develop a multidisciplinary management plan that includes fire, police, and natural resources staff. And the plan looks at taking a more active approach to managing invasive species along the corridor to suppress fuels and prevent future fires. And now I'll hand back to Carrie to talk about incorporating climate resilience.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. Great. So all the strategies within the guidebook can really be summed up as strategies for planning, design and construction, and managing and maintaining trails. Starting with planning, planning is an opportunity to incorporate a resiliency element to how you prioritize trail projects, as well as focus on how to site trails properly in your area. You can incorporate thoughtful ways of addressing equity, environmental justice, and social resiliency as you engage with members of the public also during that planning process. You can also intersect your trails planning with your emergency response planning. Here in Oregon, we have our wonderful statewide land use planning goals. Goal number 7, areas subject to natural hazards, requires that local comprehensive plans address Oregon's natural hazards such as flooding, landslides, tsunamis, wildfires, and other locally identified natural hazards. So I wanted to point out that we do have a lot of other types of planning here in Oregon, not just comprehensive plans. We have TSPs, we have transportation system plans, active transportation plans, parks, recreation, and open space plans, strategic plans, corridor plans. We have so many plans. And this means there are so many opportunities to embed resiliency into your local planning processes. Embedding trails and resiliency into these plans really builds the case for these types of projects, and it also diversifies the types of funding that you can go after to implement them. A quick example of this is in Portland, the Blue and Hour Bridge over 84. Right now, it's a fantastic bike ped bridge over a highway, but it's also the only earthquake resilient bridge over 84 for quite some length of distance. So just a quick snapshot there. And additionally, these plans are processed to have conversations in your community with your political leaders, your local residents, your businesses, your land managers, your equity communities, really everyone. Moving on to design and construction. Through design and construction, you should be thinking about how your local climate is changing. That's pretty obvious. But based on that, you should incorporate a design that can respond well and hold up to these changing conditions. Again, there's an opportunity to incorporate equitable trail design, maybe thinking about local connections to residential areas or to neighborhoods with fewer resources, or thinking about how trails as community spaces, placemaking spaces, etc. You can also think about trails for evacuation and emergency response. I mentioned earlier that trails are a redundant network in your transportation system. That redundancy can work for humans, but it can also work for your fire and emergency response teams as well. So it's important to bring those teams into the design and construction conversations to make sure those trails are designed to handle those types of vehicles when the time comes. And then lastly, management and maintenance. You can really improve resiliency through that vegetation maintenance, just like the example that Emily shared on the Bear Creek Greenway. You can also be thoughtful of visitor use management and community stewardship as a way to create community buy-in for management and maintaining trails. So thank you so much for listening. I encourage you to check out the guidebook. We'll drop the link in the chat. My contact and Emily's contact information is here, so feel free to reach out to us. And thank you so much. Now we'll transition to John's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I shall transition, right, Steph? Okay.
Yes, please do.
All right. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be presenting today with, you just heard from a really good, solid professional group of people from Toole. Great to be in your company. And Steph, obviously, a really great pleasure to be presenting on behalf of some things that are going on in California with friends and colleagues up in the state of Oregon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's been happening in California. California is different. California apparently is always a little bit different. This is a joint strategy for sustainable outdoor recreation and wildfire resilience. Again, my name is John Wentworth. I'm the CEO and the board president of the Mammoth Lakes Trails and Public Access Foundation. I'm also an elected official. I serve on the town council of Mammoth Lakes, where it is currently snowing pretty hard. And I'm also a native Oregonian, having been born in Medford. So I feel especially nice, warm, cozy vibe coming from my friends in Oregon. A little background on MLTPA and the Mammoth Lakes Trails and Public Access Foundation. We emerged, our origin story lies in public access. There's some folks here building private gates on public roads to keep backcountry skiers out of residential neighborhoods, that kind of thing. So after the inevitable hue and cry from the local population, we pulled together a program to take this mishmash of federal wilderness areas, Forest Service, district rangers, different Forest Service units, all kinds of stuff. This is probably pretty familiar to folks working out in the West, and we put together a process and a new trail system master plan. We organized this into a Mammoth Lakes trail system. So not a whole lot of new construction initially, at least. We're building new trails now, but just getting things organized is always a good place to start. So we started with that, but being Californians, as we were doing this work, we looked around to the rest of the Western United States and said, Colorado's got an Office of Outdoor Recreation, Utah's got an Office of Outdoor Recreation, Oregon, I think you guys have an Office of Outdoor Recreation, or you have one. It kind of comes and goes. Washington State's got something. But funny how California, where the biggest per capita spend is in the country, there's nothing like that. There's no home for sustainable outdoor recreation in the state of California. Don't tell anybody in California that, but it's true. So we got together with a bunch of folks and put together a white paper to try to connect the values, the needs, and the interests of outdoor recreation with very progressive and kind of thought-leading policies coming out of the state of California, called the CALREC Vision. It's a nice white paper. We did this, of course, as all important things happen, we did it during COVID, which was a lot of fun. But certainly communities like ours, we were dealing with an overwhelming surge of human beings looking to escape to nature, coming up to the Eastern Sierra, overwhelming our resources, which was fine. But it really underscored the urgency of trying to do something in the state of California to connect outdoor recreation to state policy, to get it embedded with state leadership, and to get it embedded into a program where the state is establishing a program of regions throughout the state. And we're having some success with this. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. One of the ways that we're getting there is that a good friend of ours who ran something called the Tahoe Conservancy in Lake Tahoe is now the lead, the executive sort of director for the California Wildfire Resilience Task Force, which published a resilience action plan in January 2021. And we got a call, or I got a call from a guy named Patrick Wright, who said, hey, we've got a goal in this statewide forest action plan, wildfire action plan, to address sustainable outdoor recreation. We need a joint strategy to improve access to sustainable recreation. Would you be willing to step up and help out with that? Well, sure, of course we would. So we signed up. This was coming out of a big tree mortality crisis, which has now kind of faded a little bit into the background, but we stepped up. And we put together a sustainable recreation CALREC Vision key working group, to guide and build and create a joint strategy. These are the folks that we had involved in this. We had everything from LA County Parks and Recreation, Forest Service, obviously, Park Service, Sierra Nevada Conservancy, which is the state conservancy, NOAA, all kinds of different folks got together in a very focused virtual environment. We worked over about 12 months to pull together this joint strategy. A lot of key working group meetings, outreach to practitioners, to communities that have been going through wildfires. It was a really terrible wildfire season when we were doing this. At the end of the day, we produced this joint strategy. We presented it to the Wildfire Task Force at a meeting in Grass Valley, September 29th, 2022. This is somebody you may know, someone you may not. The gentleman on the left is a guy named Greg Williams from the Sierra Buttes Trail Stewardship, the home of the Downeyville Classic. I'm sure some of you have been down there, coming into Northern California. The gentleman on the right is Wade Crowfoot, who is our Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency. So we presented to the task force. The Forest Service was kind enough to acknowledge this joint strategy with a Partnership of the Year award in 2022. Kind of a nice little bonus prize. That was nice. And why not California? California, I'm sure most of you don't know, is half of the state is managed by the federal government. So half of the geography of California is federal public lands. Now, this is Forest Service, Park Service, it's also Department of Defense, NOAA, it's full-on federal landscape, which means there's about 50 million acres that are ostensibly available for some degree of sustainable outdoor recreation. So that makes sense to do that. The charge that came to us from this joint strategy was to reframe and draft a strategic change in how California approaches that intersection of sustainable outdoor recreation and wildfire resilience. So I'm going to go through just a couple sort of high-level overviews of what's in this thing. My colleague Chelsea Taylor, I think she may drop something in the chat to a website. You can get more information if you need it. There are four goals in the strategy. The first is to integrate forest health and sustainable outdoor recreation. Fairly straightforward, obvious goal to try to achieve. And this is just a sample of some of the key actions that you'll find in these various goals. Things like maintaining public access as the climate changes, and Carrie talked a lot about that. The climate is changing, meaning what public access means is going to be changing. How do we develop integrated communication systems, which are so lacking when you get into really deep trouble with the wildfire and recreation assets, and start talking about adding public education to forest health projects, fuel treatment projects. How do we start bringing the public into understanding what a fuel treatment project is and how it can benefit their recreation assets? Advance inclusion and access for all throughout California. This is still a top priority for the state of California as a top policy objective. Key actions, things like integrating this into school programming, minimizing the impact of wildfire-related area and facility closures to public access and recreational use before, during, and after wildfires. Develop an outdoor recreation infrastructure across the state that provides for diversity of recreation experiences. Again, California does not have an Office of Outdoor Recreation. Outdoor recreation does not have a home in California. So we're trying to use this joint strategy as much as we can to broaden what those opportunities may look like. Promote the health and well-being of all Californians through outdoor recreation. This image, I'm not sure if this applies so much up in Oregon. Probably does. You get a big, nasty wildfire burning and the smoke's coming wherever it may be coming. It's going to come down into the urban areas. We've had big problems in San Francisco, Los Angeles, obviously this last year in San Diego with the smoke and the impacts of wildfire just permeate the entire state. So how can we improve air quality advisory communications and increase opportunities for indoor recreation? Sometimes these smoke events can go on for months. Kids, families need places to go to play and exercise and do things. Do we have adequate indoor recreation facilities? And finally, to support economies to enhance sustainable outdoor recreation. This is a fairly obvious and straightforward thing, certainly where we are in Mammoth Lakes. How do we support fundamental community infrastructure, provide technical assistance to local businesses that are dealing with that intersection of wildfire and their recreation economies, even things like developing a post-fire insurance program for the outdoor recreation economy. So it's a fairly broad, broad set of goals and a broad set of key actions, but it's really intended to be useful in communities throughout California, from the mountains down to the coast and everywhere in between. There's a nice cheat sheet, which is on the website that hopefully is in the chat, where this is all distilled into a very simple 4 or 5 page document that any community can take and say, well, gee, does this work for us? Is that going to work for us? And these are things that are important to be doing. The implementation of the joint strategy was a little bit of a disappointment. We were waiting for the state of California, the Forest Service, to show up and distribute it and make it a mandatory part of grant applications and things like that. It didn't quite happen the way we had hoped. So we took some things into our own hands, which is part of what this presentation is today about. And this is a presentation that I made with my good friends and colleagues from the California Mountain Biking Coalition and the Sierra Butte Trail Stewardship just a couple of weeks ago at the California Trails and Greenways Conference, to start doing outreach efforts like this to build the awareness that this thing exists and that people are doing really good work, practitioners are doing good work to bring this joint strategy to life. The Sierra Butte Trail Stewardship has done some really excellent work around their fire-hardened trails program. That was the gist and the meat of the presentation of the California Trails and Greenways Conference. And this is just an example from Goal 1, 2 key actions. Those fire-hardened trails are exactly what these things are. And there's so much room in there to start to populate and bring this strategy to life, because we're all going to need it as we go forward. And this is an example of the kinds of things we're doing in Mammoth Lakes. Mammoth Lakes, which I hope if you haven't been here yet, please come soon. I'd love to show you around. But it's a small incorporated town in the Sierra Nevada mountains, completely surrounded by Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service lands and public lands, and by a significant wildfire threat. We're fortunate to have an NGO. All good things come from NGOs and nonprofits. I'm not saying anything bad about the government, but I think we all know what we're talking about here. Who have identified this wildfire threat and doing enormously productive work to start bringing real field treatments into town to protect against that threat. So these are all like the identified units that are going to need treatment going forward. This is just a GIS, a snapshot of a GIS map. You can see where all these treatments are. I'm going to overlay now the recreation infrastructure that makes our economy possible, that makes our quality of life possible. This is why people live here. And you can just see the intersection of all this stuff. The wildfire threats, the campgrounds, the trails, the bathrooms, the trailheads, all the rest of it that make this, make our community unique and make people want to live here, people want to visit. This is what this joint strategy is intended to start to get these two sectors to work together going forward. We have a small MUP system, multi-use path system in Mammoth, and we've already started looking at how can we use those multi-use paths as fuel breaks, as treatments, as defensible space. This is our way of putting that joint strategy to work, to be proactive in the face of a threat that we're looking at. And in the Eastern Sierra region, it's about 3 beautiful counties, about 30,000 permanent residents, and 7 million visitors. That's probably 7 million opportunities to start a catastrophic wildfire. So the things that we have to do locally to harden ourselves up, it's real, and I'm sure it's real up in Oregon. So this is a quick look at what's in this CALREC Vision website. And if you can, there'll be a QR code at the end of this. There's always a QR code these days, where you can download if you live in a jurisdiction that might be interested in adopting this. There's draft agenda text. There's that nice summary of the key actions, the full resolution or smaller size resolution samples of the strategy itself, and resources you can get from the Wildfire Task Force. And this is, Steph, as you're talking at the beginning of the presentation, the federal government's up to no good these days, and certainly they're going to be coming at all of us in the Western United States with very ambitious goals for timber yields, fuel treatments in forests. And I think if you can get this joint strategy adopted in your community, the Forest Service shows up and they'll have a mandate to do certain kinds of things, and that's great. But you'll be able to have an inventory of your recreation assets and say, okay, by the way, while you're doing these treatments, let's do this together. Let's make sure that the recreation assets don't get compromised, and perhaps even they get enhanced as we go through a fuel treatment process. So down in our region, the town of Mammoth Lakes has adopted the strategy, as is our Eastern Sierra Council of Governments. Inyo County, Mono County, Madera County is going to be scheduled to vote the coming weeks. And we're reaching out to folks like yourselves. And I'll put my email address in the chat if anybody wants to reach out. But this is something that maybe it came out of California, but it's being promoted by a native Oregonian. Let's spread this thing all across the Western United States. We can arm ourselves up for whatever's going to come. So there's a QR code. You can click on that if you want. And thank you very much for your time, your attention. And Steph, turning it back over to you.
Great. Thank you to all of our panelists. And now we have some time for questions and answers. If there are questions, we invite folks to drop them in the chat or the Q&A feature. We're happy to grab them from either spot. But also want to open it up for if we have, anything else too that our panelists want to draw out from each other. Your fair game as well. We've got a hand raised from Kirsty. I see you. Let me see if I can elevate you to presenter mode for a moment here, Kirsty, so we can hear you. Okay, you should be able to unmute and speak your question out loud.
So I got a question because I know California's transitioned away from a lot of motorized recreation. Do any of these plans address the motorized recreation to help try and protect that element of recreation?
Yeah, Christy, thanks a lot for your question. I'm not, there hasn't been any change to motorized recreation in California. To be clear, the Green Sticker Fund, which is based on, which benefits motorized recreation trails and facilities, is the only funding resource really that the state of California has on a reliable basis to fund any kind of recreation. So motorized recreation is doing quite well here in California. And everything having to do in that joint strategy is activity agnostic. If it's legal, we support it. That's how MLTPA rolls, and that's what's in the joint strategy. And we communicated and reached out to a number of the motorized advocates here in California to make sure that we were on track. The motorized community does amazing work with helping to do fuel treatment work, to help, post-fire, to do things with dealing with hazard trees and stuff like that. So the motorized community is a big part of what we're doing.
Christy, I just want to also plug a case study that we included in the FHWA guidebook that's actually in Carson City in Nevada, but it's OHV trails around the Prison Hill area. And it's a great example of how these principles for climate resilience can be incorporated for motorized trails.
Okay, thank you. I guess my main concern is I'm hearing gossip where California is implementing all the electric motors and doing away with gas motors. And there's a big uproar in the communities with ATV recreation where not many of them are electric vehicles.
Yeah, as far as I know, these are larger policy things that the state of California is pursuing, but I'm not aware of any restrictions going on in terms of motorized use and motorized ATV and OHV use at this point. I haven't heard any mandates about that. I mean, I see people with, electric battery powered snowmobiles and things like that running around, but I'm not aware of any mandates like that.
Thank you. I appreciate that information.
Sure.
Thanks. We have another question in the chat of if there is information about incorporation of historic registered sites in these plans. And it says ex-cabin structures and permanent fuel breaks when the surrounding area is also listed in RHP.
The only thing I would say to that is the idea with the joint strategy is on a community by community basis, make sure that your assets are documented, get them into a GIS database. If there is then a fire and you've got a wildfire, fire incident team shows up and they're figuring out how to fight the fire, at least all those critical assets, the historic assets, are represented, and that's going to inform how firefighters actually deal with and try to treat and deal with the fire.
Any other thoughts on the historical structures piece before we go to the next question? All right. We have a question about examples of how shared use paths or trails have been integrated into emergency response planning.
Yeah, I think I would recommend taking a look at the FHWA guidebook. We have a full section in there about principles of incorporating trails into emergency response and preparedness. I think a really good example and actually a case study that's in the guidebook is in Paradise, California, following that fire, and just how during the fire, the trails that they did have served some purpose for ingress egress, and they realized that that was an asset, and they have since really worked to expand their trail network to help in the future in case of another fire event.
Yeah, it's always a good idea to get the first responders in your community to start looking at trail infrastructure, look at recreation infrastructure. How can those things factor into either field treatment work or in the event of a fire, access egress, emergency access for vehicles? One of the things we did in Mammoth was look at the standards for bridges, recreation bridges. And Carrie, you mentioned that bridge goes across 84 that's earthquake resilient. You can do a lot of work with recreation infrastructure. It's going to be probably more resilient than a lot of the the standard municipal infrastructure. So yeah, get your first responders to look at the opportunities they've got to use the recreation infrastructure to do things they got to do.
Do we have any other questions from our attendees today? Or also any questions our panelists would like to pose for attendees to answer in the chat is fair game as well. And as folks spend a minute thinking about that, returning a little bit just to the federal outlook for folks doing this work. You know, we heard lots have heard guidance from lots of federal partners and nonprofit um, partners for folks who are navigating kind of the current federal space, to just be really mindful of how we're talking about things. We've talked about kind of all of the multiple benefits of resilient design in this webinar, and you know, really the guidance is you know, if you're doing climate focused work, don't talk about it in your current federal grants. Don't talk about it in that context. Just talk about the wildfire aspect, you know, kind of the mitigation and hardening and restoration side of things. Whereas, you know, in other agencies on the state level and local level, we're very much still building towards climate goals and environmental justice and equity goals. So it's really you know, all of those goals are true, all of those outcomes are true, but we're having to do a lot of adjustment in how we frame things. And thankfully the benefits are many of kind of resilient planning and design and maintenance. And so really tailoring kind of how we talk about this work across different opportunities is just really critical right now. And I wanted to share, we don't, I think, have a date to share quite yet, but Oregon Trails Coalition is partnering with Nonprofit Association of Oregon on a couple of upcoming webinars that I invite folks to keep an eye out with, that kind of will get a little bit deeper into talking about how we frame the work we're doing in this moment, and how we can continue to do work that aligns with organization and local and state agency values in the context of current constraints. So keep an eye out for that. We don't have a link to share quite yet, but that'll be in our newsletter going forward. Any final questions or thoughts to share before I talk about our wrap up and where folks can find more info? All right. Well, big thanks to our panelists today. We will have a webinar recording and along with the link shared today up on our Oregon Trails Coalition blog if you had to join us late or want to share this content with a colleague. And yeah, thanks for joining us today. Gratitude to our presenters. And yeah, look forward to continuing to work with partners like these for sustainable trail systems that serve all the needs of our communities. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.